Welcome, everyone, to the Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host, and also the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we discuss today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear what you're planning on implementing in the comments. Today, I'm very privileged to have as my guest Dr. Iris Firstenberg, an Adjunct Professor of Psychology at UCLA and the Adjunct Professor of Management at the UCLA Anderson School of Business. She specializes in strategies for creative problem solving and innovative thinking. She also conducts programs on creativity and innovation for a wide cross-section of the Fortune 500 organizations, including companies in aerospace, software, telecommunications, and defense, to name but a few. Welcome to the program today, Iris.
Thank you. Hi, Charles.
Great to have you here today. Today, I'd love for the topic really to be around what you kind of mentioned in your book, and you list a lot of good examples in the book, one being the Ritz Carlton on how they build that culture, that right mindset within that organization that really builds this engagement throughout and gets people to where they're operating as a cohesive unit, engaged with the process and embodying the values of that organization.
Yes, so I'll tell you what they do at the Ritz Carlton, which has been emulated in a number of other organizations that I can tell you about. So at the Ritz Carlton, they have 10 values, and many organizations have their organizational values. And the question then becomes, how do you as a team, how do you as an individual know that you're living up to those values? Are they just some list that nobody pays attention to? And so creating standards as a team is in fact a way to identify the values and how we as a team expect them to live up to those values. But at the Ritz Carlton, what they do is, in order to really bring their company values and make them part of the DNA of a team, they celebrate them. And they celebrate those values daily. How do they do it? At the start of the shift, every team around the world gets together for just 10 minutes and they call it the daily huddle. And in those 10 minutes, they're talking about a single value. And every team around the world is talking about the same value. And in that discussion, they're talking about great stories. For example, where have you seen somebody live up to this value? Have you lived up to this value above and beyond in a way you want to share with others? And it's a 10-minute of positive storytelling. What's really impressive is that everyone's talking about the same value around the world, and everyone knows which value we're going to talk about tomorrow. So throughout the day, you are primed, and this is a word we'll talk about, you're primed to think about or look for, even at a back of the burner level, stories of you that you can share tomorrow. And so the Ritz Carlton has 10 values, and it takes them 10 business days to get through the values, and then they just cycle through again. So it's a never-ending process of constant reminder of what our values are and how we're living up to them, but all in a very positive way.
That's a great story. There's many other stories you have in the book, one about Citigroup and the questions that they ask, and it's embodying those values, right, to prime the pump, to get you thinking in the right mindset, which I think is a great transition into priming and how important that is in creating the right mindset to build that engagement with your employees. So if you could just unpack, what does priming mean and what kind of primes are we looking at when we look at employee engagement?
Great. So in the psychological literature, there's a great deal of research on this idea of priming. So first of all, what is a prime? A prime is some kind of stimulus that brings certain things into greater focus. You don't even have to be aware of the prime. You could be aware of it, but it could also be impacting you without conscious awareness. And so let me give you an example of a prime. I think one of the most remarkable studies that was done on priming. One of my colleagues at the Anderson School at UCLA, her name is Margaret Shi, and she did a study on Asian women. And she divided them into 3 randomized groups. And she told them, we're going to be taking a math test. Now, The stereotype around Asians in math is that Asians are good at math. And the stereotype around women in math is that women aren't so good at math. But these are stereotypes and they're old, and do they have any impact on us? And they're nonsensical, right? We don't believe in these stereotypes. So before she gave them the math test, she gave everyone a questionnaire. And there were 3 types of questionnaires. One questionnaire asked the participants all kinds of questions that got them thinking about their gender. For example, what dorm do you live in? They were divided in those dorms by gender. How many times a week would you say that you wear a dress to class? Another group, they were asked questions that were priming them to think about their ethnic background. For example, what country are your great-grandparents from? What languages are spoken in your home or in your family? Those sorts of questions to make them think about their Asian background. And a third group was just given very neutral questions. Now, if these questions have no impact, everybody's math scores, all 3 groups should be the same. We're randomizing the subjects, so there should be really no difference across the groups. But in fact, what she found was that those who'd been asked to think or had been primed to think about their gender underperformed the control. They did not perform as well as the control group. And those who had been primed to think about their Asian background had actually outperformed the control group. And later, when asked, why did your performance either suffer or why did you think you did so well? No one had a clue that it was in fact in any way related to the questions that were asked before the exam. And by the way, these findings about questions, demographic type questions asked before a standardized test are now so pervasive and have been found so many times in different research programs. It is now standard practice on these types of exams to ask those demographic questions after the exam. So if you take a standardized exam like the GRE or the LSAT, or those questions are asked later, not before.
And that's what's so amazing, is that the impact it can have on your thinking and behavior be one of your blind spots and you're not even realizing it. You had mentioned too that there was a study on old age where subjects read words regarding old age, and as a result, they walked more slowly. Yeah. Other studies have shown similar effects. Arizona 2000 general election, voters were more likely to vote for a sales tax to fund education if the voting booths were within schools, which blows my mind that people have that predisposition. They don't know it, but they're more inclined to act in certain ways based on these external outside influences.
So let me share with you that those influences don't have to just be external. You can prime yourself. Here's some really interesting research. Most of us have passwords, way too many passwords, most of which we can't remember, and it's very annoying. And many organizations require us to change our password every month. So we're really annoyed by that. And so a lot of people choose very negative passwords, right? I hate my job is their password. Now imagine that you are typing that sort of a negative password in every hour to get into your system. That actually is going to impact your emotional state, your psychological state, compared to choosing a joyful password. So there's amazing research showing that when people choose joyful passwords, whatever it is, whatever brings joy to your life, versus negative passwords, it actually impacts them physiologically and psychologically.
Wow. How about Absolutely. The smile prime? Because the smile prime to me was fascinating because people don't maybe see it that way, but if you smile, as a result, cause and effect, your mood will improve because of just the simple act of smiling.
Yeah, so let me tell you about the physiology of smiling. All right, so first of all, when you're happy, you smile, right? So happiness leads to smiling. The research question was, could the opposite be true? If happiness leads to smiling, might smiling lead to happiness? Now, looking physiologically at the effect of smiling on our brains and on our minds and on our emotional and psychological states, the research is overwhelmingly interesting. What do I mean by that? What are the effects of just plastering a smile on your face, literally faking it? First of all, the muscles involved in smiling force more oxygen up to the brain. And oxygen is, of course, as we know, essential to our ability to function, right? The brain requires oxygen. So already we're in a better state. We've got more oxygen in our brain. But in addition, the smiling impact is that dopamine and serotonin, basically the feel-good hormones, are stimulated to become released. It also lowers our cortisol levels and the expression of other stress hormones. In fact, some very interesting Botox research. So Botox can be injected to freeze frowning muscles. And when people are unable to frown, it actually impacts levels of depression. They feel less depression. So smiling can, just even like we say, fake it till you make it. Smiling can actually change our mood, even if we weren't in that mood to begin with. Absolutely.
Now we know there's some scientific proof with it. It's
Yeah.
just not good to say, but there's some backing with it with science. Now, there's two types of stories that prime different types of thinking. So the hero stories inspire us. The typical hero story tells us that heroic gamble that paid off. It primes us to think how to move forward. And then the other type of story, right, are these failure stories that warn us. They mainly say, don't do this, and are cautionary tales about how and why terrible things happened to us in the past. Which one is better to have? I would say they both hold some value, but there's some issues, right, with having that default setting of telling too many failure stories.
So this kind of goes back to what they do at the Ritz Carlton, doesn't it? So if they're getting together for 10 minutes and sharing stories, they're really sharing hero stories. Look what somebody did. Look how inspiring and motivating that story is. And that does propel you to feel better. You're in a positive frame of mind during the day from these hero stories. Whereas, as you point out, the failure stories instill fear and anxiety, and they narrow our thinking. And quite literally, again, going back to the neuroscience research, when we tell hero stories about how somebody did something exceptional and wow, wouldn't it be great to live up to that kind of behavior? That puts us in an optimistic, grateful frame of mind. If we look at the part of the brain that is dealing in complex problem solving, that turns out to be right behind your forehead. It's called the prefrontal cortex. But that part of the brain is tied intimately to the emotional brain. And when people are in an optimistic, grateful, happy mode, that emotional state is turned on and it's positive, it actually activates the complex problem solver part of our brain. If people are feeling fear, anxiety, it turns off the complex problem solver part of our brain. So when it's turned off, you can barely think of a solution to a problem. You get really locked into the first one you think of. You're not at all receptive to constructive criticism. You're just very, very narrow in your thinking versus being in a positive frame of mind where you're much more creative and open and able to come up with that next innovative breakthrough in a much more likely fashion.
That is great. And priming doesn't mean that we deny or ignore our weaknesses and uncertainty or chant these positive affirmations that everything's going to be perfect, Pollyannish. The point is that we approach every situation with some sort of mindset. So we take the opportunity to actively create the mindset that's the most conducive to your success, in this case, to getting engagement, to getting them to buy into the process and have a stronger vested interest in their jobs and with their organizations.
Absolutely. The reason we're pointing out, and I think we're emphasizing the positive talk, the positive passwords, the positive conversations, is that how many of us, our default self-talk is negative. We focus on our failures, we focus on our weaknesses, we focus on the one thing we did wrong, and we berate ourselves and we just can't let go of it. And while of course it's important to learn from mistakes, of course it's critical, how harsh we are on ourselves, it needs to be balanced with an appreciation for the amazing effort we're putting forth and the small wins we are achieving. And so one more thing to note is something in psychology called the progress principle. And the progress principle says that if you have an audacious goal you're heading for, and of course there's going to be failure along the way. There's going to be challenges you have to overcome. It's hard to achieve tough goals. People will give up a lot faster if they're not sensing some sort of progress. And so what are you doing for yourself and for your teams to celebrate the small wins, to celebrate the effort people put into achieving goals? I'm not talking about the big celebration at the end of the project. And then, of course, we only celebrate it if we like the outcome. I'm talking about daily or weekly celebrations. And a celebration, of course, does not have to be, pizza and balloons. There are many ways to show appreciation and acknowledge effort that don't involve even having to be in the same room together. We can celebrate on Zoom.
You're right. And reinforcing the positive is so important with recognition through results or just appreciation, because I've never met anyone that states, I'm just too appreciated at my job. Someone's giving me too much appreciation. So, and I think leaders really need to hear this more and more, that it's so critical to keep that going, especially in these times, to make sure you find opportunities, like you state, small, not necessarily large, just ways to appreciate people and to possibly recognize them if they do something great or if the results prove that.
Well, absolutely. And let's go back to the results of the Gallup organization of people being disengaged. Why are people disengaged? In many respects, it's because people feel ignored, they feel underappreciated, they feel disrespected, they feel marginalized. And that feeling, sometimes it even feels like a punch in the gut, doesn't it? Somebody makes a comment to you that we even have that expression in English. Wow, that criticism felt like a real punch in the gut. Well, it turns out that in the human brain, the feeling of being ignored, that social pain of an insult, a critique, and the physical pain of being socked in the stomach in the brain show up in exactly the same place. That's why we say that insult felt like a gut punch. The brain can't tell the difference between the physical pain and the emotional pain of being left out, of being ignored, not listened to, underappreciated, all those things I just referenced. And so here again, we want our teams to be engaged. We can take bad news. We just don't want to be ignored. We want people to notice that we are making a meaningful contribution, at least a meaningful effort towards that contribution. And you can't do that enough.
I agree with you 100%. And staying on the positive theme, love the approach, the positive deviance approach, that focus on this, really just to add upon what we've talked about already, to keep people engaged, that focus on the positive. And really the positive deviance approach is the focus on the assets, not the deficits, looking for what is going right inside of yourselves, inside of the organization, and then amplifying that impact, right?
Yes. So let's look at the two approaches to problem solving. The typical approach is the deficit mindset, where you look for the worst parts of the problem, the stickiest parts of the problem, and you focus all of your resources on fixing that. A very different approach is the one you just mentioned, the positive deviance approach, where instead of focusing on the worst parts of the problem, you start to look for what's going right. Even if it's a very small or localized benefit, you find what's working and you try to amplify that. In short, you're going to try to squeeze out the negative by amplifying the positive. And even Peter Drucker, who's the father of management science, in one of his books, he wrote an interesting statement. He said, we should starve problems and feed opportunities. And if you think about it, that's really the positive deviance mindset. I will share with you that there's a lot of research on positive deviance. If our listeners are interested, they might want to search on the internet for the Positive Deviance Initiative, how really sticky problems around the world are being addressed with positive deviance. I can give you one that really moved me when I heard about it, and it's how I started my research on positive deviance. Was way back after the Vietnam War. Children in Vietnam were horribly malnourished, and a group called Save the Children went in to see what could be done. Now, of course, we can just airlift food and try to feed everybody, but that's not really a sustainable solution. So they went into one village. The Save the Children volunteers went into one village and they saw, massive famine. But instead of just looking at where the problem was, they tried to see, is there any family where it's a little bit better, where the children, albeit malnourished, aren't as malnourished? And they did find, they found one family where the children looked to be doing a bit better. And they looked to see what is different about those children. Despite having access to the same resources as all other families in this village, why are these kids doing better? And they noticed that the parents who'd go down to the rice paddies, like all the other parents, they weren't taking more rice, but these parents were not washing the rice. Everybody else washed the rice, these parents were not. And that meant that there was just enough nutrients from bugs and weeds in the rice to help these children, if not thrive, then survive. And this family then became the model of transformation for the rest of the village. Notice the beauty of positive deviance. The wisdom is coming from within the system. You don't have some outsider coming to tell you, oh, everything you're doing is stupid, try something else. The solution is already there. And so people are much more willing to adopt a solution that comes from within. In short, Save the Children went from village to village looking for families that were exhibiting positive deviance. In another village, it was that the families were feeding their kids a spoonful of rice several times a day instead of one meal. Within 2 years, 80% of children in Vietnam were no longer malnourished. I mean, this is stunning. This is absolutely stunning. All by looking for the positive deviance and amplifying that from village to village.
Great story. The benefit I got from that is positive deviance approaches the solution that's already in the community, like you stated, and meets with less resistance as a result, since it's not coming from the outside. So if the change comes from within, discovered by the community, it's more celebrated in the community. What we talked about with celebration fits, and voluntarily adopted by the people who need to change the most, like with the Ritz Carlton, where they were sharing stories of those values being applied and illustrated through their employees, which all of this builds that engagement, builds that vested interest in what they're doing.
I'll give you a business example of positive deviance. There was a head of HR at a very large global company. When she took the role, she was astounded at the lack of diversity in the company. And with all the diversity initiatives, she started asking, what's going on here? So essentially they were hiring, these white males were hiring clones of themselves. So instead of trying to berate them or punish them or who knows what else she could have tried, instead she looked for positive deviance. And she said, are there any managers in this company doing the right thing? And when she found them, she really amplified them. How? If there was a perk to be distributed, those managers got the perks. They got a lot more visibility with higher executives. They were invited to participate, in company roundtables with the CEO. And she's broadcasting that, right? It's in the company newsletters. So all the other managers are looking at, who are these managers that are getting all of this visibility and seeming benefit? Okay. And here again, within a few years, suddenly amply qualified people were found by all these managers who prior to that had said, no, we can't do that. So she was squeezing out the negative by focusing on the positive.
That story. We've really unpacked the mindsets that through priming, the positive deviance that's going to build to greater engagement. But now let's move from the mindsets to how to turn these behaviors into habits. And there's a whole science about this. It's really popular right now. We have some best-selling books that we've profiled on previous podcasts with Atomic Habits, with BJ Fogg's great book, as well as a few others. But give us some of the neuroscience behind it and how can we develop habits based off of science and the proven principles that you know of?
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the brain. It should be our favorite part of our head, right? So when you're born, you have billions of brain cells. They haven't done much yet, right? They're really waiting to see what's going to happen in your life. What these brain cells have the capacity to do is form connections with one another. By the way, every brain cell can connect with about 10,000 of its peers. So if you have billions of brain cells and they're all connecting with 10,000 friends, we're talking trillions of connections in the brain. Now, every experience you have creates new connections in the brain. Sitting right now, listening to this podcast, your brain is creating connections that were not there before you started your attention, right? So this is happening constantly. Our brain is constantly sculpting itself. Now, what about behaviors that get repeated? You engage in a behavior, connections are going to get formed. When behaviors are repeated, those connections get stronger. Every time you repeat a behavior, those connections get stronger and stronger and stronger. Think about driving. Here's a good example, right? You learn how to drive. In the beginning, oh my gosh, you don't know where to put your hands and your feet, and you're lucky you don't have a third foot because you wouldn't know what to do with it. The gas pedal, the brake pedal, the signals, the mirrors that you have to look at. But over time, where you engage in that driving behavior over and over and over again, it starts to become second nature. Suddenly now you could even have a conversation with a passenger. You couldn't do that when you started driving. So what ends up happening is when we build up practice, we are honing those connections in the brain. We're making those pathways much easier to activate. And so it takes a lot less cognitive resource to deploy what has now become a habit. The brain uses less oxygen, it uses less glucose, thereby allowing you to put your focus on other things like having a conversation. So building up habits does require repetition. That's the key, is repetition. That's what's going to really create that fluidity and ease of those connections. Now, what kind of repetition? It depends on the task. That's why I think that the daily huddle that the Ritz Carlton engages in is ideal. Daily is fantastic. You may not be able to do that though. Could you have a huddle with your team once a week? Or could you even do it just once a year at the annual celebration of the holidays? And the answer is the more the better, the more the better. I would argue at least once a week. Otherwise, it's no longer a habit. It's just a thing we're gonna forget to do.
Well, there's a lot of habit science right now out there about best practices to do it, how to get better at forming these daily rituals, routines, and habits, which really help us increase our ability to conquer uncertainty and shape our success. Because in these highly uncertain times, where there's so much uncertainty out there, if you can fall back on proven, time-tested rituals, habits, and routines, you're more likely to be successful despite what's going on externally, and keep that level of engagement because you have that foundation. So try to tie in, Dr. Firstenberg, with habit formation and creating these habits. How does that help us be successful in these highly changing times where there's so much uncertainty?
One of the things we need emotionally and psychologically are anchors. When there's a lot of change and all we're talking about are the changes, we can feel very untethered. We use that term, we feel untethered. And so if at the same time we talk about change, we can also remind ourselves what's not going to change. What, no matter what else, it won't change. That helps us, it helps ground us and helps us better accept all the changes that are just part of moving into the future. So what are some of the anchors in your life that you know won't change? What are some of the anchors in your professional life that you know won't change? One of the things that does not change in an organization is the purpose, is its overriding sense of why as an organization we exist. What value do we create? And if we can have that conversation with ourselves and our teams, reminding ourselves why we exist, why this organization matters, for whom we create value, and why that matters to us and to them, we're better able to accept a change in our practices to better support that purpose.
That's great. I love for us to talk a little bit now about how to bring the future to the present, because the habits get us to a better place in the future if we have the right habits and do them consistently enough. But many people discount the future too much, looking at the here and now, not delaying gratification. And then when the future arrives, it's something that they're not prepared for. Versus there's techniques that you provide that are great techniques, simple, anyone can do them, that gives you the right mindset to bring that future more to the present time.
So this is going to be the content of our session, our IMS session, in large part. One of the most intriguing things our brain can do is imagine the future. It's just astonishing. You cannot tell a dog, bring me the newspaper and I'll give you a treat next Tuesday. Yet we can delay gratification. We can, engage in work today and we don't get the paycheck until the end of the month. We're able to do that. So it's really a very uniquely human ability to imagine the future. But even for us, it's hard. It really is difficult for the brain to think in very clear pictures about the future. The future's fuzzy. There's so many unknowns. There's so much uncertainty, whereas the present is very concrete. Example, how many people work for your organization? Who are your major challengers? What's the competitive landscape? What are your best selling products? You can answer those questions. What will the answers to those questions be 10 years from now? Who will your competitors be? What technology will you have to deal with? What value will people find in your products? I don't know. And yet you have to make plans today for that future. And so in our session, we talk about habits of mind, ways that you can think differently, just exploiting the power of the human brain to think about the future in novel and provocative ways. And I go through several actionable strategies that you can deploy to think more concretely about the future. And that's why I call it bringing the future to the present, making the future more concrete, surfacing what would otherwise remain invisible to you and potentially shock you once it unfolded. Can you know those things much earlier? And we'll talk about ways to indeed allow you to see the future more clearly.
I'd like to just unpack one piece of that. And I love this piece in your book regarding stories, because leaders can use this. Leaders can engage the emotion because emotion trumps logic. And many leaders don't see that yet. They think facts, figures, charts, data. But look at Dr. Martin Luther King. He painted a vivid and compelling picture for everyone to see. Everyone knew that racial inequality existed, but it was King's vivid verbal images that connected us emotionally and propelled the federal government to take the legislative action resulting in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Famous example of it, but a very clear case where it had a compelling message attached to emotions, right, that gave people a clear sense of vision of what that world looked like today.
Indeed, stories are one of the most powerful leadership tools we possess. And the reason stories are so powerful is that we consider them the native language of the brain. What do I mean native language? When you have a small child, you're putting them to bed, we're talking a 1-year-old, 18-month-old child. You don't pull out PowerPoint slides, you're not showing them Excel spreadsheets, you're not telling them data, right? But you can certainly share a story and that young brain can already understand. So before we understand any other language, like the language of data, we understand the language of story, meaning it's the easiest way for our brains to take in information. And when we do brain scans on people who are absorbing a story, we see the whole brain is engaged, the emotional brain and the rational brain, right? The neocortex as well as the limbic system, these two parts of the brain. When you present people data, you're only engaging the rational brain. It's not the whole piece, the whole brain. And as a result, I can agree with your data, but it might not motivate me to take any action. I'm not emotionally inclined to get excited, inspired, and then take the action required to make changes. But if you embed that data in a story, now I'm excited, now I'm motivated, I might then take the action. So leaders who want their teams to engage and take action should be thinking very carefully about paint clear pictures of this future that you want to take people into.
That is great. And I think that really, I can stress that even more, that even though someone might agree with what you're saying, they're still not going to maybe take the action. Those are two separate steps.
Yeah.
And a lot of leaders think, well, you agreed with me. Why aren't you coming along with me on this journey? Because you haven't connected emotionally with them and given them a reason to motivate that action, which is so critical. And many leaders I see still missing that essential piece of it, that they've painted the picture through data. They are not a good storyteller, or they haven't connected it to a deeper emotional reason, and therefore they're not getting that engagement, that buy-in from their employees.
Exactly. And another piece to it is that I might be excited. I believe your data. I'm even excited about your story, but I'm afraid to take action. And with fear as a default emotion in an organization, nobody's going to want to make any kind of change. They're too afraid of what it might mean should they fail. So that's something leaders have to be thinking about as well. And, I'm using the word leader very loosely. You don't have to have an organizational title of leader to be a leader. Any colleague can be a leader in creating the resilience for a team. How do we look at failure? How do we treat each other when we fail? Do we have an environment where people feel safe to speak up or admit a weakness, ask for help? What kind of culture are we creating so that we do have a team that can meet setbacks with enthusiasm and move forward?
Thank you. So many great things we talked about today. We could talk about this for hours. I know hopefully I can get you on an upcoming episode as well for us to unpack other issues, because there's so much more to unpack. But we're reaching the end of this episode, so I always like to have a call to action at the end. So if there's one thing that you can get leaders thinking about right now, Dr. Firstenberg, regarding increasing the engagement of their employees, what would that first step be for them?
I want leaders to think about what kinds of stories they share in the organization. What are the prevailing stories that people are repeating? And what does that say about the organization itself? And what could you be doing to introduce new stories that will take the organization where you want it going?
Great advice. Let everyone know how they can get a hold of you.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on the UCLA directory with email. Certainly ways to reach me.
She has a great book, How Innovative Thinking Leads to Extraordinary Outcomes, that can be purchased on Amazon. So great book, packed with lots of actionable insights. Thank you, Iris, for joining me today.
Thanks so much. Hope to see everyone in our IMS session.
This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this episode with your colleagues, friends, and anyone else who might have found this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.